How many of you know what a California stop is? Yeah, I don't know if you do, but I heard this when I went to Boise, Idaho, and if you drive with a California license plate in Boise, Idaho, people are going to be pretty mad at you for a lot of reasons. One of the things about California stop is, that if you see a stop sign, you're expected to make a full stop. And for some reason, the rest of the country follows that pretty well, except us Californians. A California stop is like you just crawl slowly to the stop sign and you turn without making a full stop. Any of you done that? If you did and didn't know what that's called, that's a California stop. And if you do, you'll get a ticket if a cop sees. So do not do that. But that's just to show symbolically, especially in the Silicon Valley and Bay Area, how life is on such a fast lane and people are not patient. And when I went to Boise, Idaho for work for the first time, I would drive on the freeway. They just have one freeway, 84. And when you turn on your blinkers to cross the lane, people actually slow down. And I was like, is this real? Because in California, you're driving on 880 or 101. If you turn your blinkers on, what that means is, go fast, don't let that guy come in. By your smiles, I know you're all guilty of that too. Because life is on such a fast lane, especially here, everything is in a hurry, and we are after, we don't know what, but we are running and running and running. As we are working through the book of James, and he's giving us, the simple message of James, we all know faith without works is dead. And he's giving us one after the other of what are some things that reflect a living faith. And in this part, as he's nearing the end of his work, his writing, he is talking about suffering. And it's good that, we Pastor Susan spoke about that, and we have some living witnesses of that. And his point very simply is this. One of the sign of a test of our faith is when you remain steadfast in suffering. That's going to tell everybody what you are made of or who you are. Suffering is hard. Pain is hard. C.S. Lewis wrote this awesome book, The Problem of Pain. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to read that. And this is what he says. He says, mental pain is less dramatic than physical pain, but it is more common and also more hard to bear. The frequent attempt to conceal mental pain increases the burden. It is easier to say my tooth is aching than to say my heart is broken. Isn't it? And in that sense, every single one of us experience that sort of a mental pain as we go through life. It's also interesting and funny, C.S. Lewis, towards the end, he says this in that same book, which is titled The Problem of Pain. He says, if only this toothache could go away, as he was wrestling a toothache at that time, if only this toothache would go away, I could write another chapter on the problem of pain. It's not the big sufferings that we think are the ones that really shape us, but it is this pain and sufferings of daily challenges that we go through life that really prove to us and the world what it is that we are made of, what's our metal, And he was just talking about the pain and suffering that the people in the church were experiencing by those who were rich. This is the diaspora. They were, after persecution in Jerusalem, they are scattered. They are all over the then known world as immigrants trying to make a living, and they are being exploited by some of the local rich people. And as part of a response to that, he's telling them that life is hard. And this is very similar to what several of you go through in Silicon Valley. It's become so hard to live here, and the work pressure and places of work is just weighing heavily, and it affects all areas of your life. And if you're going to school in the Bay Area, these are not your ordinary schools. These are some of the top schools in the nation. And as a student, you're under tremendous pressure. It's hard to make friends, let alone in an environment where literally everyone is out to get everybody else. And it can be very lonely and painful and isolated, and that's a part of suffering. And you know, James, as I told you, there's a possibility he's very fascinated by the Beatitudes and what Jesus preaches on the Sermon of the Mount. There are so many parallels. And he remembers the last Beatitude that Jesus said, where he's talking about a new kingdom he has come to establish, and he has told us how you can enter into this kingdom and how life looks like in this kingdom, how you're pure in heart, peacemakers, and then it's like, what do we get? You know, when you live like this, do you get a star? It says no. It says, blessed are those who are persecuted. And so James is sort of elaborating on that part as he comes to a finish. And he's saying, you know what's going to set you apart? Who you are is something that God cares about and the world cares about. But what you and I are mostly caring about is what we do. We live in the moment. We are in a hurry. But God cares about who we are and what we become as a result of what we do. And James is asking them, who are you guys? And that's going to come out how you respond to suffering. And he says, you know what marks Christians apart is those who have a spirit of serenity, a spirit of quietness under any circumstance, a spirit of firmness and steadfastness amidst trial. And he's actually using some harsh words. He's warning us against a spirit of restlessness, a spirit of irritability, a spirit of always complaining or grumbling. He's talking about that, or being unhappy, a spirit of always being upset with the way things are and the way people are treating you. And he wants to exhort us with patience. I'm going to do the usual 3-point sermon today, so it's going to be easy for you. I know you're all tired. It's a long day. So, few verses James is unpacking for us. Being patient in our sufferings, being patient toward others, and lastly, being patient with God. Being patient in our sufferings. James chapter 5, verse 7 and 8. You can read with me. It says, be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it, until it receives the early and late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. You know, he repeats the word patient multiple times. There are two main words he uses. Some translations translate them both as patience. You know, one is the Greek word makrothumos, and the other word is something translated in English as steadfastness or perseverance, and I'll talk about that later. But the word makrothumos, you know, macro is large, it means long, and thumos means anger. So they are usually words of thumos is a lower form of anger, and a higher form is orge. And he says that what he says is thumos is someone who has thumos, or that anger is someone who just flares up. You know, you just poke them, you tick them off, they just take off on you, you know. And makrothumos is referring to someone who take a long time before they blow off. You know, it's sometimes translated as long suffering. And it takes a lot to, you know, get them to do that. It takes a long before they lash out on someone or something. And so what he's referring to as patience is when you're going through difficulties or, you know, things that bother you or you're suffering, he's encouraging them to have makrothumos, because our instant default reaction is to immediately react and respond. He says patience means to suffer or to take the suffering without lashing out. And there are different ways in which we lash out, right? We react. Sometimes it may not be physical all the time, though on the freeway people can do it if you cut somebody off and you want to test your patience meter. Just drive on peak hours on 880 and see how you respond when someone cuts you off. It will really give you a graphic indication of who you are today. But sometimes you may lash out with your tongue, you may complain, and it's still not responding the way James is saying as Christians you would respond. But if you're a patient person, it's like a delayed gratification, And the reason he says, why do we do that? Why do we have a short fuse? Is when we go through the suffering, it's our response when we lash out is interpreted as, I want to fix this. I want to take matters in my own hands. Because I think this is painful. I don't like this discomfort. I want to see if I can do something so I can push this pain away and this discomfort away. And so he gives us this beautiful illustration of the farmers, the Palestinian farmers, and the rains. And he tells about it because he's saying you can get impatient when things don't go your way. You think in your work you should have a raise by now, you don't, you're worried. You think you should, be married by now, you don't, and it ticks you off. And then you want to take matters into your own hands. Right? You think like, I think I can do this. And it's a self-pity that comes in, and it's pushing you to now go and fix it. But the model, the example he gives of farming is sometimes familiar to us too. He says, see how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for autumn and spring rains. Now, for Palestinian farmers, there were only the two rains that were very important. They couldn't plant seeds until they had the autumn rain. Although their summers are very long and very hot, very similar sort of to our Bay Area weather, they need to get the autumn rain so it can provide the moisture in the ground, so when they plant seeds, it can actually grow and have a right fruit. But what happens if the farmers are like, I'm waiting and waiting, the rains are not coming, I'm just going to do it, and they go and plant their seeds? It's not going to come and produce the fruit that it needs to produce. So that's the first temptation. And the second rains are the rains that come up in spring. They have to wait before they harvest. And if they're waiting and waiting and the spring rains don't come and they go and harvest, they haven't given enough time for the crops to fully swell up and, reach their yield, and they're going to end up not having any yield. So it's for them, it's a forced way to be patient. And he gives us that example because he's saying, don't go and try to do something by yourself because you know something. Our Lord is going to come back. You're going to be in His presence. On this side, again, as we've heard many times today, very aptly, there is going to be suffering, and that's the way of the cross. And suffering in other places we have talked about is going to produce character. And it's something that Jesus wants us to participate in. But He's going to come, and there will be rewards on the other side. But if you're saying, I can't wait till Jesus comes, maybe I have a reward when I get there, but I want my reward right now. I'm being a good guy. I'm working hard. I deserve this. I put so much into this relationship. I don't care who or she this person is. I'm just going to go ahead. Or, I've worked so hard to get this degree in my school, and I just need to find a job. I need to pay off my debts or whatever. whatever it may be, he says, if you do that, you know what you're communicating is, number one, you're not patient because you're not trusting that God's going to reward and He is in charge. In some way, you're thinking you're in charge and you want to do things your way. And so James says, when you see a patient person, it's a very rare thing. Because only someone who participates in the sufferings of Jesus and who have learned to embrace patience, you can see that there is a beauty in that. And that's the model of the farmer. So then he talks about being patient with others. Verse 9. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. These are some strong words. It says the first is just be patient. Now negatively he's saying don't grumble. And we don't think of grumbling as a problem, isn't it? It's not like big on your list like adultery or murder or even lying or anger. Grumbling. What's up with grumbling? Grumbling is just complaining, Grumbling is not so bad. But it's corning. It's more than that. It's griping. It's always finding fault, and it's nitpicking and complaining all the time. When we lived in Germany, it was very interesting for us, in having moved from India to Germany, and where we go to the tram station and we look at the sign. There's a timetable on all the tram stations. It says the tram will come at 9:17 a.m. And we look at that, and as Indians, like 9:17, maybe 9:30, 9:45, and we are just relaxed and we walk slow. The guy rolls in exactly at 9:17. You miss being there at 9:17 on the dot, you miss your tram and you're late for whatever you're supposed to do. And that really shocked the daylights out of us. And we would literally run every single time to make it in time to get the tram or the train. And so Germans are so used, I think their biggest idols are time and precision. If anything gets messed up with either of them, it just messes them up so bad, to the point that when you hang out with them in a very short time, I found one of them, maybe it's a broad stroking, may not be true, but the circle that I was, they're always complaining. They're complaining either about the weather, or they're complaining about how something wasn't on time, or they're complaining about how something isn't working and stuff like that. And so when I came to California, it was the exact opposite. Especially Bay Area, it has this entrepreneurial spirit. So if there is a problem, everyone's happy because what? They can create a solution and create a startup to solve that problem and make money. It's a very different culture here. And it was honestly very refreshing for me, and that's one of the reasons I love this Bay Area. It's people don't complain and they're not griping all the time. But he's talking about something even more than that. He's saying when you complain or when you're grumbling, there's something more than that. Why would you grumble? It sounds harmless, but if you dig deeper, you're grumbling because there is a strong sense of self-realization or self-need. You're so obsessed thinking about yourself, your need, and what you want, and when your small world is disturbed, you just can't take it. And you start grumbling. And what are some ways, how do you find people like this? Who are these people who grumble? They're very easy to spot. These are people, they can't talk about anything but themselves. You go and want to have hi to them, they start talking about their job, their kids, their family, without asking even, how are you? And therefore, when there's a problem, then they can tell you, this is this problem, that is that problem, that is this problem. Because it means your world has shrunk so badly that you're only thinking about you all the time. And James is saying, this is going to kill you guys. That's why God says he's going to judge you. And when you are doing that, your impatience grows. And people who are impatient tend to put others down, cutting others down with cold, sneering gossip, because you can't be like that. You're all made of so self-pity, and it'll kill you. And that's not a good thing. And he says God's going to judge us. And so how do you overcome this? How do you overcome being impatient and being self-absorbed? And he talks about that in this next short passage, where he's actually giving us a couple of examples. He says, he says, the reason you're impatient with others, or the reason you're impatient with your suffering, is actually because you're impatient with God. And that's the bottom line. And so he kind of gently puts two illustrations. He says, as an example of suffering and patience, brothers, verse 10, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. And tying these two things, I remember even in my own life, when we were living in Germany, as I was sharing, and I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's and given 2 years to live. And I remember that walk I made back from the doctor's office to our house. It was snowing, it was cold. I was grumbling. And I was grumbling at God. Because my life vision at that time was to come here to a seminary and study theology and do ministry. And I was like, what are you thinking, God? Do you know what you're doing? You got this awesome guy here. I'm going to do ministry. And by the way, I just have a 2-year-old daughter. I want to see her grow up. And this guy is telling me I'm going to live for only 2 years. Do you know what you're doing? I knew Reformed theology pretty well, trust me. I read Arthur W. Pink on the sovereignty of God, back to front. But yet, when God messed with my life like that, my default response was to grumble, because it was all in my head. Hadn't really sunk down, and it was God showing, oh, really, who's in charge? Oh, you're in charge. And as we started to pray, the question the question that came as I was praying was, why do you want to live? I'm like, well, I have to take care of my wife. And then God goes, oh, so you take care of your wife and kid? Interesting. Oh, you have to do ministry? You have to help me? Interesting. And really humbled me to say, I don't know anything, And over the next several days, as God walked us through, wonderful friends and others to mentor us and pray with us, He did something in our life, in our hearts. And we came out of that as very, very different people, having learned to stay patient. And the word he uses is here, hypomene, which means staying under pressure. It's a military term. And it's something like if you want to be a Navy SEAL or something, or SEAL, make it to the SEAL team, they have all these crazy exercises you have to do, like you have to stay underwater with the weights for like 3 minutes or 5 minutes, to be able to withstand that pressure and not break down. And then you have to go to the ocean. They have this thing called the Navy SEAL hug or whatever. They line you up and make you sit in cold water and stand the waves, cold waves crashing on you to see, can you stay put as a team? So that's the word he uses for being a patient or being steadfast in suffering. And he says, well, if you think that's hard, let me give you and point you to some of the Old Testament prophets. And by the way, Job, we have a very graphic image of his life. So he says, You have to look to them and see what came out of it. Because at the end, despite the pain and the suffering they went in all their life, they came out with a blessing. So God's blessing doesn't come to people who do great things, but to people who endure pain and suffering. Those who will receive the greatest blessing in life to come are those who have endured the greatest suffering in the present world. And this hope of the blessing now and in the future glory should motivate suffering Christians to patient endurance. So he says, take the prophets. I'll look at the prophets. Let's start with Isaiah. God comes to Isaiah and says, Isaiah, I have a job for you. You can read it in Isaiah chapter 6. He says, I'm going to send you to preach the gospel to a group of people over the next 20 or 30 years. This was Isaiah getting ordained as an elder, let's say. So choose some examples for you, what to expect. And he says to Isaiah, but no one will ever believe you. He says, I want to send you to people who will never hear you, never see you, never understand, and never get going. It was almost like I felt when I was a new pastor and I was first preaching, and I preach. People look at me like how you're looking at me now, and I would think like they're not listening to me. They're probably thinking about, the NBA game or the NFL game and stuff. But now I know you guys are, because I come back and ask you. And then let's take about Jeremiah. He says, Jeremiah, he preaches at a time in which Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians is coming against Israel. So God comes and says, Jeremiah, here's what I want you to tell the Israelites. I want you to tell them that right now it is my will that their country will be taken from them, and that Nebuchadnezzar is right now going to be my instrument of chastening. You're going to lose this battle. And you're going to lose the war. And I want you to tell them to surrender to Nebuchadnezzar and to obey Nebuchadnezzar. Oh, how cool is that? That was Jeremiah's call, prophet. Of course, they don't want to do that, so they resist, and then they're destroyed. They're taken into exile. And when they get into exile, they say, well, God will deliver us, and we are not going to settle down in Babylon. And then God comes to Jeremiah, and he says, tell the exiles that they have to submit. They have to get involved in that city. They have to live in that pagan city. They have to embrace the city. They have to work for the peace of that city and pray for the peace of the city and so on. You're not going back. You're not going home. Several of you, when you came to this country with 2 briefcases, thought you're going to go back in 6 months, isn't it? That's like the universal story. And here you are 10, 15, 20 years later. And so Jeremiah says, that's what I have to do for the next 20 years? Everybody's going to think I'm a traitor. Are you telling me, God, that I have to tell them, like he says, the Lord's will is that you surrender to this pagan king, give up, accept defeat? There's one place, you can read in Jeremiah 11, where all his friends in his hometown decide to get together and say, we have to kill this man. This man is preaching treason. But God told him to do. To the end, he had a miserable life. That's the story of Jeremiah, the great prophet. Oh, let's not stop there. Let's go to Hosea. It's getting more personal now, right? It's not just about kingdoms and people and pain that everybody has to deal and you go tell them. He says to Hosea, you're never going to be any kind of prophet until you understand what my heart feels like for my people. So now I want you to go and marry a woman who will never be faithful to you, Gomer. You're going to marry her. She's going to continually be unfaithful to you. She's going to commit adultery. You're going to have to continuously forgive her and go get her, bring her back. That's your life. Because you will never understand what my life is with my people until you go through that. And you're never going to be a prophet unless you have a life of suffering like that. And that's what God does to all the people he calls. He has to first break you before he can use you. So do you think these guys were excited? Oh, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea are like, yeah, Lord, I'm going to do this. So one day I'm going to write this awesome book and it will sell millions and millions of copies and I'll have millions of likes and followers in Instagram and over centuries people are going to read this book. Oh, it's going to be worth it. And let me do it. You think that was their way? No, that was not. And they still were steadfast because they saw something in the future that's going to come. And Job, beautifully, we see how we get the scoop of what God allowed Job to go through. Deep personal pain and suffering in any form or fashion that none of us will probably ever go through in life. God allowed it for for Job, and Job was steadfast. And you know why he brings up the case of these prophets and Job? It says why we really don't have patience is because we don't want to let go of our self-determination and us being God, which is big in the place like Silicon Valley, and saying, no, I want you, God, to be the God of my life. We are okay to tell God, you can be the Lord of this whole world, control everything, but just leave my life alone. Can I just take care of my life? And that's why he uses such strong words to say, no, you can't. That's not an authentic Christian. If that's your response to pain and suffering, you're not an authentic Christian. But how do you really do this? How do you really overcome this? There is a way for something to melt our heart when we get so irritable and when we get unhappy and start grumbling, and to become patient and radiant is when we think of God's patience for us. How patient he is. There was a cat, there was a pet. There was one of the videos that was caught in a small river that was flowing, and the owner of the pet, personally, I don't know how people like cats. I hate cats, but this guy loves cats. He went down, and it's cold, running water, and the cat's just clinging on. He's trying to pull the cat out of the water, and the cat's just, the claws, it's scratching him and ripping his hand, and blood is flowing, and he still doesn't let go, and he just hangs on, and he stays put till he's able to finally get it out. And then the cat is seeing that, and I don't know if the cats are grateful too. That's why I don't like them. If it was a dog, it would have licked him up. It just gave him a stare and look, okay, so what's next, I shouldn't say this. We have some cat lovers in the church. Sorry, guys, if I offended you. Bad illustration. But that's what we do, isn't it? We do this to God all the time, and God is so patient with us. God doesn't let go of us. In his long suffering, he's a God, as we read in Exodus, he's a God who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and mercy. And in the case of Job, God allowed Satan to berate him and buffet him and take everything he has away from him to test him so that he can show to Satan what a righteous man Job was. But there was a better Job and a bigger Job who was his son Jesus Christ. When he came to this world and he endured pain and suffering, and when he was on the cross, God himself personally vented his wrath and anger on him and let him go through that pain. Even when he cried out, Lord, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. He chose not to, and he let him go through that, and Jesus willingly embraced that. And it is because of that you and I can experience God's grace in our lives. Because someone who was better than Job stood the fiery wrath of God on the cross and endured and did not give up and come out of that and overcame death and pain and suffering, and he is able to be in your life and my life. And even when we walk through the valley of shadow and death, he is always with us. His rod and his staff comforts us. But to accomplish that, he had to go through that. When we think of that, it will be easy for us to let go of our control of our lives, to let go of this desire to want to be the God of our lives and embrace this Jesus who can come into our hearts and who can help us have a different view of life and take us to the finish line where there is the promised reward that is waiting on the other side of heaven. He's going to unpack more of that in the next verses. We're going to look at that, and that's an encouragement I want to leave us with. Though we are so terrible in loving God, He never lets go of us. May that grant us a repentant heart to go before Him and tell God, I'm sorry, God. I'm still not trusting you. I'm still thinking these things you're allowing is not for my good. Help me to trust you. Help me to remember that this is going to help me become more like you. And help me to remember you're going to walk with me as I go through this. And help me to stop scratching your hands when you're trying to pull me out and to come running into your arms. Shall we pray?